Elm lacks clear documentation on how to set up application routing, and this will hurt you, either by slowing you down or by sending you down the wrong path. But by the end of this video, you'll be equipped with what you need to move past this pain point and onward in your Elm application. Elm has great documentation. They introduce you to the language very softly. There's some interactive examples on how to get familiar with their types and their primitives and the syntax. There's a great section on the Elm architecture and great examples on how to issue commands and subscribe to these side effects so that you can interact with the outside world in your application. What I thought was missing, and this might be a gap in the documentation, or it might be a gap in my expectation coming from the JavaScript community, is that there was not a very good section on how to figure out how to assemble routing, set up routing in your application. There are two sections one on navigation, which basically covers for single page applications how you would subscribe and update your model based on URL changes and URL requests. And there is a great section on URL parsing on how to actually pick apart the various types of URLs, whether they be dynamic or static or query params or path params. What I felt was lacking was just an example that brought it together and showed you how to render a simple application 2 or 3 different pages. This led me to explore 2 different options. The first one that I found was elm-spa, SPA being single page application. This is basically some tooling to help you solve the what some might perceive as missing is the abstraction for routing in your application. It also takes over the creation of an elm-spa, an Elm application, single page application, supplies you with a dev server and tools to add, like elm-spa add, and you can add various types of routes given that command line. And there's build and watch and generate commands and so on. Those are all great. So this is for single page applications, and it's a good tool. The other tool is Elm Pages, which is it's kind of a hybrid tool for server-side rendered pages and pre-rendered pages. So in my case, where I'm not really interested in this particular vein of thought in the server-side case, though some might, it would be more for like a blog, for example, where you just had a lot of like static pages that you wanted to generate and serve up with your application already pre-rendered. So that would be the case of like a blog or just a site that isn't much dynamic. So I filtered out that option. It's more for static site generation as far as I see it. And the abstractions that they added to accommodate the hybrid framework, like a backend task, exist in either one of the options that you choose. So I decided I'd discard that one right away. I went down the route, though, of using elm-spa, and having created an equivalent app from the one I created in Pure Elm. While it has many pros, I think providing a dev server and some abstractions to add routes, there were additional abstractions that I just felt in the end were not quite worth it. Some of those were this additional page abstraction, so which accesses shared models and request information. And while this is good, I thought there were too many abstractions added that just made Elm that much more harder to understand as a newcomer. So for me, the abstraction didn't pay off, and it's simply because the abstractions, maybe they felt a little bit leaky in that they were good abstractions, but there was too many details that were about it that were sort of I had questions about. How does this work? What is this page function that I set up in my Elm file, and so on. So having set up an application that's equivalent, I decided for that reason that I'm just going to go back to Pure Elm and see what kind of headway I can make in just pure Elm, setting up routing and so on. Okay, so to get into the details of what I mean and how I thought the abstractions were not worth it, let's take a look at this elm-spa that I built. So first, let's take a look at this view abstraction. So this is an abstraction that comes from elm-spa. Now normally you would have this, like in Elm you'd have like an HTML message that would be the type for your view, but now we have this additional view message. So that's another abstraction that you have to learn. Secondly, I found myself dealing with the page abstraction. So in the case of a dynamic route, as in, when we want to see a block by state hash, we want to look up that block by state hash, the state hash being the dynamic path property. There is this additional page function that you set up, and this is something that comes from elm-spa, and it does some things like, for example, it does help you access the request params, being a parameter to the page function, but it's an additional abstraction that I think adds to Elm in a way that doesn't really, being an abstraction, you would expect it to hide information and make it a little bit more easily accessible, but it's just found myself wondering, like, what is this page function? What does it do? How come it has to be that complicated to access params? So furthermore, there is this params abstraction that you have to import into your file. So for example, this gen params, then I'm not really even sure how this is being generated, but there's it then follows the structure here where we have blocks and state hash. So this has to be imported in a very specific way in order for those params to be accessible. So again, there's 3-4 abstractions, params. There's some confusion on how to import it. There is the request object, there's the page function, and then there's the view type, which all these together I felt they weren't hiding away details that were making it easier for me to understand how to do URL parsing. Now let's go back over to the other project that I have written, elm-spa, and this is just in pure Elm. So here is my home page, my home view, my block spotlight view, and my blocks.elm page. So blocks, block spotlight, and home. And here is the main Elm file. So we've got a type defined for our pages, or routes, some people call them. And these are constructors. Takes a string. These take nothing. We've got our initialize function that gets passed to as part of application initialization to take control of the page. Takes in flags, which is ignored in this case, the URL and the nav key, and it stores those in the model, or resolves, in the case of the URL, resolves it right away to a page, from a URL to a page. And then we've got our message type defined, how we're going to update the model in response to URL changes. Pretty straightforward. A definition for how to parse the URL. So either we get a page or we get nothing, and in that case we want to default to the home page. We've got our parser set up, and then finally we have our view page, which is a switch on the page after it's been resolved to the URL. So for example, so here's our view function, takes in the model, and then our model.page is a type that we pass into view page, which is then switched upon to render the different views of the different Elm files. So when we say home.view, we're talking about this home.view. So I thought, that's pretty basic and straightforward. There's some abstractions, but I think coming in to this fresh, if I have to learn all of this and then I have to learn additional abstractions that elm-spa provides, I'm not sure if it's worth the effort. And so for that alone, I would say if you're new to Elm, if you're coming from the JavaScript world, perhaps there's additional relatability there. I would just stick with pure Elm. Now, to look at this from a stars perspective, the Elm codebase is divided into a couple different Elm GitHub. The Elm codebase is divided into the compiler and the core, and together those two have, like, if you just want to pick the largest of them, 7.6 stars. Now, elm-spa has 400 stars. So I would say that it hasn't really caught on in the community, and I think Elm Pages has even less than elm-spa, if I'm not mistaken. So I would say if you're new to Elm and you're trying to figure out how to get going, the example that I have for you right here should be enough for you to get going, to get up some routes set up so that you can get going coding your Elm application. So if you want to see more of how this Elm application will evolve and see its suitability as a next generation web development language, then like, subscribe, and follow me on this journey.